Welcome to Wall Street versus Main Street, a different take on the investment show with our host, Dax White. Dax White is the managing partner of the White Law Group, a national securities fraud, securities arbitration, and investor protection law firm with offices in Chicago, Illinois, and Vero Beach, Florida. The White Law Group has represented hundreds of investors in FINRA arbitration claims against their brokerage firms, and throughout this show, Mr. White will shine a light on some of the tricks of the brokerage industry, while also providing valuable information for investors on how to successfully navigate the investor-financial advisor relationship.
Welcome, everyone. You're listening to Wall Street versus Main Street. I'm your host, Dax White. This is a different take on the investment show. I'm not going to give you my stock picks for the week. Here's the hot thing to go by. I'm not a licensed professional. That's not the objective of the show. Instead, I am a securities attorney, somebody who exclusively focuses his practice on representing investors in arbitration claims against brokerage firms. And through that practice, there's just over the course of a number of years, been a lot of information that I've picked up that I wish more investors knew. Things that I think would be helpful for an investor to know when they embark on that relationship with a financial advisor to best protect their interests and make sure that they're hiring somebody who's going to look out for them. So that's the objective of the show. Is each week we'll try to tackle various topics and to sort of pass along that information and try to arm you with the stuff that I think would be really helpful for you, either in establishing a new relationship or making sure that you're with the right person now. So let's get started. This week, what we're going to talk about is how to pick a financial advisor. The sort of that like seminal, okay, I've decided it's time. I don't want to be managing my own money anymore. How do I go about and find the right person to be? It's a huge decision. We're talking about somebody who's you're going to entrust your life savings with to make sure that you're set up to someday not have to work anymore. I mean, isn't that the goal? And so obviously it's an important decision to make sure you're picking the right person. And it's not enough to say, oh, my neighbor is a financial advisor, I'll use him. Or, my buddy down the street's got a guy who's done great for him. Let's call that guy. There are wonderful financial advisors out there who genuinely care about their clients. They've got a huge background in economics and business, and they are actually very adept at positioning their clients for reaching their goals. That's one end of the spectrum. There's also the guys who have been sued 45 times, should be kicked out of the business, but somehow they're still in the business, and they're ripping their clients off right and left. And most of the financial advisors are somewhere in between. So how do we make sure we end up on the spectrum of somebody who's going to look out for my interests and do a great job for me, and make sure we avoid those people who are taking advantage of clients? So that's sort of the objective here. Is let's talk about, at least from my perspective, some of the things I wish investors knew, did, etc. The first thing is just making sure to ask them what their background and experience is. And that one seems pretty obvious in terms of course, we would want to know that. But I think there's this assumption amongst investors that all financial advisors are financial gurus that really understand the markets better than you, and that they're all really great at what they do. And this is a misconception that is very much actively preyed upon and pushed by the brokerage industry. If you have a financial advisor, I can almost promise you that his title is vice president. That is a title that they give to virtually every financial advisor, and they do it for a reason. They want you to think, oh man, this guy's he's a vice president. He must be really good at this. Again, that's a perception as opposed to a reality. Most of these guys are vice presidents. So it's not enough to say, oh, my neighbor says call his guy and he's the vice president at an ABC brokerage firm. Again, most of them have that title. So you got to actually ask them, what's their background? What's their experience? Because there aren't actually any requirements for brokerage firms in hiring in terms of, graduating from a 4-year college with a focus on investments or economics or business or anything. What they are typically looking for when they hire somebody is somebody with sales experience. And that's not who I think most people are looking for. But the problem is, I think that's what most people think they're getting. They think they're getting this person who's got a huge, long, illustrious career in investments and the markets and et cetera. When, again, you might be getting somebody who's got a GED and then went to a community college and studied philosophy and took a 6-week course on investments and got their registration, and now they're out there selling. So ask them about it. Find out what their actual background is, what their actual experience is, and make sure that's consistent with your expectations and what you were looking for out of a financial advisor. And again, I think that one's kind of a no-brainer, but I do feel most clients don't ask because they're assuming that the answers they want are the answers they would get. You got to ask the actual question. The next thing I would say is ask about their actual licenses. There's a huge spectrum, and I've talked about this in previous episodes, but there's the bare minimum requirement, which is what's called your Series 7, and then there's all the way up to what's called a CFP, and that's a Certified Financial Planner. And the bare minimum is, again, guy graduates from college or girl graduates from college, gets whatever degree they get, and brokerage firm decides to hire him because they see potential, and they set them up with a training course, 3-4 weeks, and then they go take their Series 7. And the Series 7 tests for baseline knowledge, i.e., what's a stock? And then you got to say, okay, that's an investment in a company that is equity in the company. And what's a bond? And that's an investment in a company that is, buying debt in the company. And it's testing very baseline, rudimentary knowledge that obviously anyone who's going to sell investments should know, but it doesn't suggest just because you pass that exam that you have any kind of like actual sophistication and knowledge of markets and how things work. And, we're seeing right now volatility in our market. You would hope your financial advisor would have some sense of not necessarily what's going to happen next, but at least being able to put it into a context and historically understanding, okay, we've seen a 7.5% correction. Here's where I would start to be concerned. Here's how maybe we want to reallocate our portfolio to protect you. Passing the Series 7 is not going to give you that baseline knowledge. So ask the question, do you have your Series 7? Okay, obviously they have to have that. If they don't have that, walk out of the room. But they have to have their Series 7, and if that's the extent of what they rattle off to you, then ask them how long they've had it, how they did on that exam, and what their other experience and credentials are. But if they've got the CFP, that's the gold standard. That's the one you're looking for, because that is an additional layer of training that they've gone through to get to a point where they can actually write financial plans and be able to sit down with clients and go through, rather than just selling investments. Those are people who can sit down and say, okay, what are our objectives? How are we going to get there? Here's the financial plan. Here's what I suggest to make sure we meet those goals. And there's also baseline requirements of how long they've had to have been a financial advisor before they can even get their CFP. So most of the guys who are out there selling investments, that's their goal, is to get up to a CFP. So I would say that that's probably who you're looking for, but assuming you don't have somebody who's that experienced, who's willing to work with you, then you probably want somebody who at least that's the objective, because that suggests that it's somebody who's going to spend their entire career as a financial advisor, and they want to be accomplished and very good at it in their training to get there. So ask them about their licenses, where they're at, what they're trying to get to, and if they've got the CFP already, that's a big step. That's definitely a check in the direction of, okay, let's keep talking to this person to see if that's who we want to work with. The next thing I would certainly ask them for would be referrals or recommendations from their existing clients. Can I make sure, can I talk to some of your other clients? And obviously, if they give you names, they're going to cherry pick names that the person's going to give a glowing response. But I think it's important to ask the question, because if they say no, I don't want to do that, I don't want to put my clients out or put them in that position of having to talk to you, that's a huge red flag. So I think it's important just to ask that question, just to sort of gauge their reaction. And then, of course, it is important to talk to the clients, because maybe you'll get somebody who's candid and says, yeah, I only use this guy because he's my, wife's friend or whatever. But I think, again, this is a huge decision. You're talking about entrusting your entire life savings to somebody. It's got to be more than just, my buddy says his guy does great. Why don't I call that person? Do your homework. Make sure that you're working with the right person. The next thing that you should ask them is, how do they get paid? Because there's generally two structures in the brokerage industry. There's either a commission-based model where they're actually getting paid based on each transaction that you enter into, Or there's the fee-based model, which is typically in assets under management. Let's say you have $1 million portfolio. They'll charge you 1% annualized of that portfolio, which would be $10,000. And that's how they get compensated. And the reason it's important to ask is you have to make sure that the way that you're going to be paying this person marries with what you want. And what you want would depend on how you're planning on trading. If you're a buy and hold person and you're going to maybe do 2 or 3 trades a year, and then, you're going to do your IRA at the end of the year, $5,500, and you're going to want to talk to the broker about how to invest that. But you're probably going to just, other than that, just sit there and let, you're a long-term investor, then a commission-based model might make sense for you. Because, you don't want to be paying 1% assets under management to just sit there and have the portfolio never turn over. Whereas if you're going to be a more active investor doing a number of trades and really having an active relationship with your financial advisor of, making adjustments, throughout the course of a year, maybe the fee base makes more sense for you because, you're going to have more involvement there. And if you were on a commission-based model, maybe that's going to be more than the 1%. So ask the question, make sure it's sort of consistent with what the type of portfolio that you're planning on having them set up for you, and figure out which of those systems is going to work best for you. Because there are 2 systems out there, and if one of those makes more sense for you, make sure you're getting somebody that's actually going to do that for you. The next thing to ask them is who they're registered with. There's 2 basic models of brokerage firms. There's what's called the wirehouse, which would be your Morgan Stanleys and your Merrill Lynch's and your Goldman Sachs, etc. And in that model, you're usually going to have a big office in a major city where there's 20 to 30 financial advisors. And in that same office, there's going to be a compliance person, there's going to be supervisory people, there's going to be administrative people, operations people. But basically, all the things that go into supervision are all in the same office. The other model is what's called the independent model, which is typically firms like LPL and Raymond James, Edward Jones. And that's one where the financial advisor is basically, he's got his own shop, he's got his own office, and the supervisory capacity of the LPLs, the Edward Jones, et cetera, is they come into the office once a year and they audit the books and sort of make sure, okay, yeah, it looks like you're doing everything right. The majority of my practice is against the independent model because, of course, in the independent model, the supervision is considerably less than in the wirehouse model. And so you're going to see more problems there. And that doesn't mean you should eliminate a broker who's independent, but it's certainly worth asking the question because those are the ones who have at least the bad advisors are typically going to be an independent model because that's where they can get away with more stuff. Doesn't mean you don't see problems at wirehouses because it definitely happens, but it just given the amount of supervision that goes into those 2 different models, I mean, it makes sense that that's where you're going to see problems. But the other component of asking who they're registered with is making sure that you're with a solid company. Ultimately your relationship is with that individual, and no matter how good the supervision is, if you're with the wrong person, it won't matter. They'll still find a way to do the wrong things because they'll know what the supervisory capacity of their firm is, and they'll work ways to get around it. But if something does go wrong, you want to make sure that if you end up in a dispute with that brokerage firm, that you're in a dispute with somebody who actually has the wherewithal and capacity to pay you. If they screw up, you want to be able to sue them and have them be in a position where they can actually write a check. Because I would say that the hardest part of my job is not in terms of evaluating new potential cases, is not evaluating the liability aspect of the case. Because usually, if we're willing to bring it, that's going to be clear cut. Like I'm not going to bring a claim that's sort of a gray area, and I'm not even sure if the financial advisor did anything wrong. That's usually obvious. It's extreme cases where horrible fraud or horrible negligence. And so that part of the analysis is usually pretty easy. The hard part for me is the collectability. It's usually some small firm that I've never heard of, and we've got to do a ton of research on, do we think they have insurance? Do we think that they have, the financial wherewithal to even pay out on a claim like this? And so if you're in that unfortunate situation where you've got a broker who's taking advantage of you, you don't want to have a situation where you call a lawyer and they say, look, there's nothing I can do for you because that firm, if we sue them, is immediately going to go out of business. So, ask who they're registered with and make sure it's a company that's pretty substantial. Again, some of those independent firms that I just rattled off, they're not going anywhere. It's a different way of doing business, but LPL is a huge company with thousands of financial advisors. So is Edward Jones, so is Raymond James. But there's some smaller names out there where you just don't know. And so if they say, yeah, I'm registered with XYZ and you've never heard of them, do your homework and make sure that you're willing to work with that company. The next question that is worth asking is, do they carry E&O insurance? If you get into that situation again, unfortunately, where you're in a dispute with your financial advisor, you want to make sure that they're going to be in a position to pay out any kind of claim. And I think that the assumption of investors is that brokerage firms are required to have insurance and financial advisors are required to have insurance. And so you would think this is not something you'd have to worry about. And the answer is that is absolutely not the case. There is no regulatory requirement. I would say that most financial advisors probably do. Just from a business standpoint, you would want to have coverage just to protect yourself in a small business context. But they're not required to do it. And the ones that don't, that would be a red flag to me, because that would suggest that someone who, hey, if I get sued, I'm just going to shut it down, not pay anything, and leave the business. And so I think it is worth asking that question, making sure that the answer is, yeah, of course I have The final one, and this is the most important one, and I've talked about in other episodes, and I probably should talk about it every single week because it's that important. But the final thing is, look them up. Most investors don't realize, but FINRA actually publishes all the information you would ever want to know on your financial advisor. And they do so at finra.org, FINRA.org. And in the upper right-hand corner of the very first page of that website is something called a broker check. And you can type in the name of your broker, and it will spit out a report that will tell you everything you want to know. It will tell you how they did on their licensing exams, everywhere they've been registered, whether or not they've been sued by a customer before, have they ever been fired by a firm before, have they ever had any criminal charges against them, have they ever declared bankruptcy. Virtually anything you would want to know about your financial advisor when making this huge decision is in there. And again, I just wish it's something that everyone knew. FINRA is actually finally doing some advertising to make it more known that this resource is out there. But it provides wonderful information. And again, we get calls all the time where they tell us who they worked with, and we look the guy up, and he's been sued 45 times, and you're wondering, how is this person in the industry? And it's a travesty. But more importantly, if that person had looked them up and saw that they had been sued 45 times, I promise you they never would have entrusted their life savings with that person. And so that should be the first thing that you do before you pick somebody. And if you got somebody now, look them up. Make sure that you want to stay with that person. And if there's some red flags in their broker report, ask them about it. I will say, in fairness to financial advisors, if they've been in the industry long enough, they're unlikely to have a spotless record just because it's the nature of the business. I don't typically start making a huge deal about it at a hearing in terms of calling an advisor a bad financial advisor until you start seeing a number of customer complaints. So if they've got one, like, it probably can be explained away as, I had a client who was, he thought I was going to do this, but I really did this, and here's why I did it, and whatever. But it's certainly, check them out. And if there's something that concerns you about it, ask your broker about it. But that's to me the absolute most important. I wish every client knew about that, or every investor knew about that, because it's got all the information you would want to know. So do those things. And if you do, I think you'll have a much more productive relationship with your financial advisor. We're going to take a break. And when I come back, I'm going to talk a few minutes about the types of things that we're seeing right now and the types of cases that we're involved in.
Because you want to... Aquafeeder Services? Because you want a safe, sanitary, and energy-efficient pool in your backyard. Rediscover your why and get back in the pool of your dreams. Aquafeeder Services is a state-certified pool renovation expert with over 13 years in business in Vero Beach. Let Aquafeeder Services help you get in the swim again. Aquafeeder Services, water for your life. 7940586, part of the iTix trading community. Your iTix dollars are welcome.
Finally, it's arrived in Bureau. A1A Fingerprints comes to you. Are you a nurse, CNA, child care worker, massage therapist, school volunteer, realtor, or lawyer? The state of Florida requires a fingerprint background check for your state licensure and renewals. We make it easy with walk-in, same-day service, and no appointment necessary. If you are a healthcare facility, we'll come to you and screen all your new hires with the fastest turnaround time and also bring your current staff up to date. In a recent law expansion, all massage therapists must now be fingerprint background checked effective July 1st, 2014. Visit a1afingerprints.com or call 772-494-6556. We're here to make your fingerprinting easy. A1A Fingerprints. If you're a healthcare facility, we'll come to you, saving your employees the trip. We have same-day mobile services available. A1afingerprints.com.
I believe that the earth was born when the sky turned blue. All the things that happened to the earth prior to that, I look at all the history and all the geology that happened. But to me, the earth was born when the sky turned blue, because that's when it became habitable. MrJustThinking.com.
Welcome back, everyone. You're listening to Wall Street versus Main Street. I'm your host, Dax White. Before the break, we spent a few minutes talking about how to pick a financial advisor. And again, it was from my perspective as a securities attorney who represents investors in claims against brokerage firms. Now, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the types of things that we're seeing, the cases that we're involved in right now, so that investors, if you're being pitched these investments or if you already own them, it may be worth doing a little bit of due diligence and making sure that there's not a problem. There's always going to be the rogue broker, so a certain percentage of our caseload is certainly involving random financial advisors throughout the country that have a slew of problems. But that's not going to be relevant to you necessarily, or hopefully not. But in terms of the types of, the majority of our cases are usually going to be product specific, where there's just, it's a bad investment. And then you've got financial advisors who are willing to sell it even though they should have known that it was a bad investment. And so that's most of the cases, and that's at least one where I can provide some guidance and say, hey, if you own this, it's, or if you're being pitched this, maybe it's worth, again, doing some more homework on your end. And those would be non-trade REITs, non-trade real estate investment trusts, oil and gas limited partnerships. We see a lot of those cases, equipment leasing funds, tenant in common real estate deals, anything that's like a Regulation D private placement where your broker puts in front of you a 60-page private placement memorandum and says, oh, don't read this, don't worry about it, it's just some disclosures, it's boilerplate legalese. That should be a red flag to you. If some lawyer had to spend 25 hours drafting something with that many disclosures, there's a reason. So a lot of the cases involve that. There's a series of cases. If you don't live in Puerto Rico, you probably have no idea, but Puerto Rico is having all kinds of economic problems down there, and their debt, their bonds are having substantial problems. That has filtered over into bond funds that own Puerto Rican debt, and also closed-end funds, specifically closed-end funds sold by UBS. They've got a substantial problem with those. And then we're also seeing bond cases involving oil and gas debt. Junk bonds, typically things that were paying like 8-10%. If you're being offered those investments, red flag, maybe do some homework. If you already own them, red flag, maybe it's time to talk to a lawyer. But that's basically what we're seeing right now. Again, really what it is our cases are generally the nexus between commissions, what's going to make more money for the financial advisor, and then greed. Guys who are willing to overlook whether or not that's maybe in the best interest of clients because they want to sell it. Anyway, thanks for listening, and we'll talk next week.
You've been listening to Wall Street versus Main Street. The views expressed by the participants of the program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by, the White Law Group, its officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, nor any of its subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer.